Last Wednesday night, we finished our introductory look at the different types of unbelief. And then we started talking about the section in the first chapter of our study manual dealing with reasons for unbelief. And we talked a little bit about this first one being a bias against God. And simply what this is people claim to not believe in God because they don't want to believe in God. They enjoy the way they're living their life. They enjoy the sins that they're in, and they don't want to change. And they know that if they place their faith in God, then they would have to change their way of life. And that's not something they are willing to do. They have a bias against God. Then we talked about the influence of parents and a child's upbringing. We talked a little bit about the fact that parents play a major role, at least in most instances, in the development of a child's faith or the lack thereof. A lot of times, if a child is brought up by Christian parents, chances are that child is going to grow up to be a Christian. And even if we remove this from the religious spectrum, generally, if a child is brought up under a certain moral ideology, a certain moral code, generally they'll grow up to have the same mentality as their parents. You know, we see so many people that were brought up in homes where the parents were racist, or they were sexist, or they had some type of views against certain groups of people. And oftentimes those would carry over to those children. So often what our children see in us and the way that we raise our children is going to carry over into their future life and is going to have a bearing upon whether they are someone who believes in God or whether they are going to disbelieve in God. Well, then, as we were summing up the class last week, I mentioned that we were going to spend most of our time tonight on this third area. And it's what I'm referring to as improper education. In your book, it just has the heading education. Now, the reason that I have termed this improper education is because education in and of itself is not a bad thing. We all would admit that it's good to have at least a degree of education. You know, that's why we send our children to school. That's why we go to college. That's why we have continuing education in whatever our field is. That's why we go to seminars or we read materials that talk about new advances in whatever field it is that we're interested in. Education in and of itself is not a bad thing. But education, when it is improper, when you're not being taught the truth, that is a reason for unbelief. Now, this next statement is one that, in my opinion, is one that is quite startling. Many of the most outspoken infidels that are alive today wear the title professor. They are the ones that are teaching in our schools. They are the ones that are having an influence on our young people. And some of them are some of the most outspoken opponents of God that you will find. Let me share just a few of those, and some of these are people that you might be familiar with, some of them maybe not. Does anybody recognize this man? Probably not by his picture, but what if I put that name up there? Most of us have heard of John Scopes. We may not have heard his name, but we probably have heard about a court proceeding that had to do with this man. John T. Scopes was a high school science teacher in Dayton, Tennessee. In 1925, there was a law on the books in Tennessee that stated that the theory of evolution could not be taught in the public school classroom. Well, John Scopes, he believed that you should teach, every theory that's out there. You should be exposed to creationism. You should be exposed to evolution. If these ideas are out there, You need to teach them. You need to throw them all out there and let people make their minds up for themselves. Well, in 1925, they had what has come to be known as the Scopes monkey trial. And it was referred to that because in the theory of evolution, of course, they teach that man evolved from a lower form, meaning they evolved from primates. And so it came to be known as the Scopes monkey trial. Well, during that trial, John Scopes ended up being convicted. There was no way to get out of it. He had broken the law of the state. The law stated that you could not teach the theory of evolution. Well, he taught it. He was fined $100. Now, in 1925, $100 was about the equivalent of $1,500 today. But about a year later, on appeal, that was overturned. Now, I have included Mr. Scopes in this presentation for one reason. In 1925, you have a man who was a public school teacher who was convicted and fined, even though it was overturned, convicted and fined for teaching the theory of evolution. And notice this, he never again worked in the field of education. Never again was he allowed to be a teacher. Because in 1925, this was understood to be false. This was not fact. This was a theory. And this man never stepped into a classroom and taught a class again. His reputation was tarnished because he taught something that was false. But then we come a little bit more modern times. Has anybody heard of Richard Dawkins? Richard Dawkins, for many years, was one of the foremost atheists in the world. He was a professor of biology at Oxford University in England. And in his book that I've got a picture of there, The God Delusion, he made this statement: religion is a delusion, something that people believe in despite a total lack of evidence. Now, this entire book, just about every sentence in that book, I could put up here in a quote and it would be shocking. But also, he made this statement. He said, I have no explanation for complex biological design. All I know is that God isn't a good explanation. So we must wait and hope that somebody comes up with a better one. So essentially, he's saying, you know what? I can't explain how all this came about, but I know it's not God. God's not a good explanation, so I'm going to hold out and I hope somebody at some time comes up with a better idea, a better conclusion. Now notice what I said his occupation was. He was a professor of biology, teaching young people. What about this man? This is a name that most of you probably have never heard of before. John Shelby Spong is a former, he passed away a couple of years ago, but he's a former bishop in the Episcopal Church. But during his life, he was a visiting theologian at numerous universities and seminaries across the world. Here was a man that was seen as an expert in the field of religion. He's the author of several theology textbooks that continue to be used even in some of our brotherhood schools today. But Spong, he called for a fundamental rethinking of Christian beliefs away from traditional theism. Now, remember from our first lesson, what is theism? It's the belief that there is one God. He called for us to get away from that. That's an old view. We need to evolve our religious beliefs. We need to throw away our traditional doctrines, our traditional ideas. Well, some of his views, he says, there was no immaculate conception. Mary wasn't conceived of the Holy Spirit. There was no virgin birth. Jesus was just a man, and he was such a good man that God adopted him as his son and gave him rights as deity. He also says that there was no bodily resurrection of Jesus, that Jesus simply lives on in the memory of his disciples. Essentially, the body of this man Jesus is still lying in the tomb somewhere in the Middle East. That Jesus never rose from the dead. That he just lives on in memory. He made this statement. He said, if Jesus was truly divine, which he was not, and he had to die a physical death in order to accomplish God's spiritual plan, look at this, then Christ is a failure. Just a truly good man who was defeated by a cruel death. Folks, you know what this is? This is heretical. It's heretical and it's blasphemous. Because what he is saying, he's saying Jesus is not God. Jesus is not the Son of God. There's nothing divine about him whatsoever. He was just a man that God liked, and so God decided, well, I'm going to accept him as my son. But there was nothing divine about Jesus. Well, three men, Paul Barnett, Peter Jensen, and David Peterson, writing a response to one of Spong's books, said the notion that Jesus was resurrected in a totally spiritual sense while his old body lay in the grave is a purely modern conception. First century Jewish thinking would never have accepted such a view, and that is not how Jesus' resurrection was proclaimed in the earliest accounts. It would have been impossible for resurrection claims to survive in the face of a tomb containing the corpse of Jesus. So simply put, he said, if you're going to say that Jesus was not actually resurrected, that his body remained in the tomb, but that Jesus lives on in memory, just like all of our loved ones that have departed from this life, they continue to be with us through our memories. If that's how you're going to say that Jesus was, then it would be impossible for his disciples to defend the claims of the resurrection. Because all they would have to say, all the Jews would have to say, all the Romans would have to say, you know what, we can take you down here and we can show you his body. It's still in the tomb. Well, Spong also has a deistic view of God. He says that since God will not intervene in our lives, then there's no reason to pray to God. Why would we pray to God if God is not going to take action to answer our prayers? Deism, you may remember, is the belief that God set everything in motion and then has just kind of held himself aloof from the world. Everything that happens basically based on providence. It's not that God has ever intervened in any way. That is just how God has intended for everything to come about. Well, Spong says, well, there's no reason to pray to God. Don't pray to God because it's not going to do any good. Then near the end of his life, he began to promote that homosexuality is acceptable and even praised by God. He actually debated some of our brethren on this subject. And if you ever want to go on YouTube and look up some very interesting discussions that are had there. But of course, the arguments that Spong makes are empty. There's nothing there to support those views. But then lastly, he believed that the Bible is not inspired, that it is filled with contradictions. Now, just a moment ago, I told you that here was a man who was a bishop in the Episcopal Church, but that he was a visiting theologian at numerous universities where he aided in the education of those who were going to be ministers. So the question arises, does he fit the description of a theologian? No. He fits the description of an infidel. What about this man? If you've not ever heard this name before, I would say probably you will. Because Bart Ehrman is probably the foremost atheist in the world today. Bart Ehrman, just like Spong, is a former priest from the Episcopal Church. He is a highly educated textual critic. A textual critic is one who looks at the ancient manuscripts of the Old and the New Testament and determines what was in the original and what was not. He actually trained under a man by the name of Bruce Metzger. And if you ever go back and you study the history of the English Bible, and you look at the decade of the 1900s, that name, Bruce Metzger, is going to come up over and over and over because he was a highly respected textual critic. Well, Bart Ehrman was his right-hand man for a number of years. Well, then Bart Ehrman became an agnostic and later an atheist because he began to study the subjects of evil, suffering, and its effects on man. And he came to the conclusion that if there is evil in the world, if there is suffering in the world, then there cannot be a good, all-loving God. If there is a good, all-loving God, then God would not allow evil and suffering to take place. Well, some of his views, he says the Bible is not inerrant, meaning the Bible is not perfect. It's not exact. He said through the years, as the scribes would make those copies, before the Xerox machine and the printing press, it would be copied by hand. Well, he said, the scribes, they just changed it to suit whatever doctrine they wanted it to say. And so he says, what we have today is not accurate. He also believes that heaven and hell are not accurate in the sense that we believe them to be accurate. In fact, he claims that hell does not exist at all. He takes the view that if you depart from this life in what we would say an unsaved condition, or in a condition, in his opinion, that is not worthy of being resurrected to live on earth again, that you're simply going to cease to exist. Annihilationism is what it's called. But he says that this traditional view of heaven and hell, he said Jesus never taught that. He said Jesus never taught that we have an immortal soul. Jesus never taught that we're going to be resurrected. That Jesus never taught that we were going to go to heaven. Well, what does John 14 say in the first 3 verses? Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go and prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, what did he say? I will come again and receive you into myself, that where I am, there you may be also. But no, Jesus never taught that man has an immortal soul. He said that Jesus and Paul taught that this physical body is just going to be resurrected at some point. At some point in the future, that this body, it's going to be resurrected. And really what this is a common view among the Jehovah's Witnesses. They believe that this physical body is going to be resurrected and is going to live again here on this earth. That there's not really a heaven or a hell. But here's where it gets really interesting, in my opinion. Bart Ehrman is skeptical of his own view. This is what he holds to. This is what he teaches. But he claims, he personally believes this life is all there is, but he hopes that there's happiness after this life. He hopes that there's something else. And this is what led to his rejection of the concept of hell. He wants everybody to be happy. Well, if anybody goes to hell, they're not going to be happy. Therefore, there cannot be a hell. Here is what is so startling to me about Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman is the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Here is a man that is teaching our young people. And these are the kind of views that he holds and the kind of things that he is promoting. Once again, would we call this man a theologian? No. He's an infidel. But it's not just a problem with state-funded schools. You know, this argument has always been out there. Well, you know, you have separation of church and state. You know, if it's a state-funded school, then these things have to be taught. Well, folks, it's not just a problem in state-funded schools. Many denominational schools, and even some of our brotherhood schools, have struggled in the past with the teachings of evolution, with denominationalism, and with this blasphemous view of theological liberalism. Now, here's a school that everybody's heard of. Harvard University. Everybody's heard of Harvard University. It's founded in 1636 with the purpose of training Puritan clergy. What do we know about the Puritans during that day and time? They were a very strict, very rigid people. Very much like what we would think of as, say, like the Mennonites that we're familiar with today. They were very much so seen as a people that focused upon the letter of the law. Harvard University was founded to train Puritan clergy. It is now the oldest and most revered university in the United States. And it continues to operate a seminary where it trains ministers generally for what's known as the congregational churches. Those predominantly exist in the Northeast, and they've come to be a very liberal denomination. Many of their preachers will actually kind of cycle between the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, the United Churches of Christ, and the congregational churches. Those three are seen as the three most liberal religious groups in the United States. There's almost nothing that they will take a stand for. Pretty much you can believe whatever you want to believe and be in their fellowship. Harvard University has promoted liberalism, theological liberalism, since the 1950s. Back, I believe it was in the late 1950s, maybe 1960s, we had 2 or 3 of our brethren that decided that they were going to attend Harvard University to get their doctorate. One of those was Dr. Jack Lewis, who spent many years at Harding Graduate School in Memphis. Another was Leroy Garrett down in Texas. I can't remember who the third was. But they said that even in those days, the liberalism that was being taught in those Bible classes was appalling. So since the 1950s, they have been promoting these concepts of theological liberalism. But then we're introduced to this man. His name's Greg Epstein. More than likely, none of us have heard of this man. I had never heard of this man until I started preparing this lesson. In the year 2005, Greg Epstein was named the humanistic chaplain for Harvard University. Now, this term humanism is one that has come to have several different meanings, basically dependent upon the era of time in which it was being used. But modern humanism, here's a good definition of it, is the pursuit of happiness and fulfillment in life outside of religion and generally based upon physical pleasure. Ultimately, whatever makes you feel good, then that's okay. You don't need God, you don't need the Bible, you don't need morality. Will you remember what I said Greg Epstein is? He's the humanistic chaplain at Harvard University. He made this statement. He said, if you ever meet anyone who tells you that religion can offer all the answers, run for the hills, or at least hide your wallet. Well, folks, it gets even worse than that. Because in 2021, 2 years ago, this man was named the head chaplain over Harvard University. A college founded upon very strict Bible principles now has an avowed atheist as the head religious figure on their campus. It's startling. It's startling. Well, there's an example of a private school, what we would consider an Ivy League top-tier university, one that claims, at least to an extent, to still have a connection to religion. But what about our brotherhood schools? I mentioned earlier, we're seeing issues in our brotherhood schools. You know, atheism and the teaching of atheistic doctrines such as evolution used to be grounds for public correction. You know, that people would be written up in brotherhood journals. They would be approached publicly before the assembly of the college. The board would come together. They would deal with these matters, and many times they would lose their job. They wouldn't be allowed to continue on. But now, many of our schools will employ, endorse, and defend even those teaching the most rank of errors. Folks, we have schools today that have allowed social clubs to form on their campus that are made up of homosexuals. We have brotherhood schools today that have allowed social clubs to form on their campuses that are for atheist students. And these are schools that are supposed to be affiliated with the Lord's church. Many science teachers are allowed to teach the theory of evolution without any fear of recourse whatsoever. They even teach it as the truth in some instances. Atheists are invited to come and hold special lectures on many of those campuses. Morality is no longer governed by biblical mandate. Whatever society says is acceptable, well, that's what we'll go along with. Well, I thought as Christians we were supposed to be different from the world. We're not to be conformed to the world, are we? But yet that's what's happening in many places. Again, homosexuality is accepted and praised as being normal. But then look at this. I thought this was quite revealing. One of our colleges, they reported that only 7% of their students come from a Church of Christ background. 7%. 17% claim to be atheists. And as a result of this one university has lifted the requirement that all students must take a Bible class every semester. But we're still sending our young people to these places. Churches are still supporting these places. We still claim them as being brotherhood schools. But these things are taking place, and really what it boils down to is administrators and boards are catering to the desires of their contributors. Whoever gives the most money calls all the shots, rather than standing up for God's truth. And so what it boils down to is this. No longer can Christian parents send their children to a Christian school and just automatically expect that those children are going to be taught the pure gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, we do still have some schools among us that I feel are doing a good job. But for the most part, we see more and more that are moving in this negative direction. And so what happens? Coming back to where we began. Reasons for unbelief. I can't remember the figure. One of you may have seen this as well. But there was a study that was put out, I believe it was by a professor from Harding a couple of years ago, where he had polled many of the young people that were coming from a background of having been brought up in the Lord's church, who then went off to college. And in his study, He focused just upon those who went to our brotherhood schools. And what he was looking at in that study was how many of those departed from the faith after leaving their parents' home, after leaving the oversight of their parents. And it was startling. I want to say that in some instances, in some of those schools, it was more than 50%. And almost across the board, it was right around 50%. And so many times, we'll see parents, we'll see preachers, we'll see elders, and they'll just shake their heads and say, we don't know what's happening. Folks, this is what's happening. Our children are being fed this mess. And we wonder why. So many are going astray. We wonder why so many of those preachers that are being trained in our schools today come out and they're really no different than those in any of the denominations around. We wonder why they're coming out and they're against those long-held biblical truths that we have evidence to back up. Well, it's because, like we saw here tonight, they are being improperly educated. They're not being taught the truth. And as a result, many of them are losing their faith. Folks, in my opinion, and then I'll open it up for comments after this. In my opinion, this third point, at least in our society today, is probably the number one reason for unbelief. It's because of what they're being taught. All right, questions or comments?
Back in, and you know this, the history probably 10 times better than me, but I remember being told that in 1901, when the Christian church, the split over instrumental music occurred, that the universities associated at that time went with the more liberal view.
Right.
And I mean, that's understandable to some extent because, universities and young people, that's where a lot of these ideas are really spread. And that, there's not an eldership there over them. But it seems to be that's where it is. We're seeing a move in that direction again. Right.
And I hate to say this, but I would say that within the lifetime of some of us here, we will see another major split in the Lord's church between those who are striving to remain sound and those who are wanting to move in this liberal direction. I hate it. That's not what God intended. Christ himself prayed to God that his people would be one, that they would be united. But it's when we remove the Bible from its context, it's when we start injecting our opinions and our desires, that's when we start having problems. And I didn't even go into some of the other things because we're going to see this in future lessons. Even within the Lord's church today, we see some that are trying to defend the theory of evolution, but they put it within the realm of religion. They call it theistic evolution. They say, well, God created everything in this way, and God's the one that's causing these changes. God's the one that's causing this evolution. No. That's false teaching. But we're going to talk about that, like I said, when we get into those future lessons that deal with this subject of evolution. But that's where we're going to stop for tonight. And Lord willing, next Wednesday night, and I'm going to say this, but those of you that have been in my classes long enough to know it probably won't happen, but my intention is to finish this first chapter next Wednesday night. But I appreciate your attention. I know that this lesson is one that can be very discouraging when we think about these things. But it's things that we need to know. We need to understand. Because these are some prominent figures, prominent names. And if we're going to be able to defend what we believe, we're probably at some point going to have someone come to us and say, well, Bart Ehrman argues this. Or Richard Dawkins said this. We need to know who these people were. We need to know how to defend against those false teachings. Okay, we're going to stop there for tonight.